Okay, let's dive right into this explainer by asking a surprisingly simple question. Why is it that a perfectly grammatical sentence can still cause an absolute disastrous social conflict? Seriously, think about it. You could say something that is structurally flawless, every single verb conjugated perfectly, yet deeply, deeply offend the person you're speaking to. Well, today we're going to explore exactly why that happens. We're mapping out this fascinating transition from rigid, abstract grammar rules to the incredibly rich, messy reality of real-world social communication. And this brilliant quote by sociolinguist Dell Hymes really hits the nail on the head. He said, "We need to know when to speak, when not, what to talk about, with whom, when, where, in what manner." It perfectly captures the solution here. Hymes moved us way beyond mere grammar into what we actually do with language. He recognized that language is first and foremost a social tool. Knowing the words, well, that's really only half the battle. Knowing the sociocultural rules of use is what actually allows us to survive and thrive in any given speech community. So here is our roadmap for today. It's really a comparative guide for students of applied linguistics to map out this journey from abstract theories to actual classroom and business applications. We'll quickly cover the limits of perfect grammar, the social shift, the parameters of communicative competence, status and cultural contexts, repairing real-life breakdowns, and finally, putting that theory into classroom practice. All right, starting off with Section 1, the limits of perfect grammar and how abstract rules clash with real life. We really have to start our journey in the 1960s with Noam Chomsky. Chomsky famously argued that linguistics should only focus on linguistic competence. That means studying the innate, abstract grammar rules of an ideal speaker who is basically completely isolated from the real world. But Dell Hymes completely rebutted this. He argued that linguistic competence alone totally fails to account for the rich, messy social variables of human conversation. I mean, if you only know the grammar, you might be able to read a complex textbook, but you're going to be completely lost when trying to navigate a casual conversation. So Hymes introduced communicative competence to show that you need to understand social context, actual usage in diverse communities to survive, not just mental grammar algorithms. Which brings us to Section 2, Hymes and the social shift, focusing on the ethnographic approach. You see, Hymes insisted we absolutely cannot understand language without understanding the actual people who use it. By using an ethnographic approach, meaning observing language as a lived, breathing environment, he proved that social variation isn't just random noise or performance errors, which is what Chomsky thought. It's actually highly systematic. Whether it's dictated by gender, socioeconomic background, or status, language isn't just some neutral background. It's an active architecture that reflects our social hierarchies and relationships. So let's look at how that actually works in Section 3, Parameters of Communicative Competence, or as I like to call them, the 4 rules of engagement. The crucial point here is that to truly communicate, we have to master Hymes' 4 parameters of communicative competence. The very first one is possibility. This simply determines if a statement actually conforms to formal language rules. Basically, is it grammatically and syntactically possible within the English language? This is essentially that foundational linguistic code that Chomsky originally focused so heavily on. Next up is feasibility. Now, this deals with how we rapidly process instances of language in real time, given our normal human cognitive limits. For example, a listener can easily process a sentence like, "The police chase a criminal." But if you endlessly stack clauses on top of each other, making it incredibly complex, even if it is perfectly grammatical, it just becomes completely unfeasible for the human brain to parse in a normal flowing conversation. Then we have appropriateness, and this one is absolutely huge. It brilliantly illustrates our opening question, actually. Appropriateness clears up the relation of language to its context. You could formulate a perfectly grammatical sentence, right? But when speaking to a police officer, you should never ever address them as darling. It is completely inappropriate for the context, the power dynamic, and the required social register. And finally, attestedness. This parameter confirms whether something is actually done or commonly performed in reality by a specific speech community. A phrase might be possible, it might be feasible, and it might even be appropriate. But if native speakers simply never say it, well, it lacks attestedness. Mastering this is exactly what makes a speaker sound truly fluent and natural, rather than sounding like they just read a phrasebook. Moving right along to Section 4, Status and Cultural Contexts. Let's talk about navigating the social world. Because knowing the grammar just isn't enough, you have to know the culture. Think about how socioeconomic status drastically shifts language use in professional settings. Imagine a scenario where you are really angry. As an employee, you simply cannot use the same aggressive register or threatening language with your boss as you might with a peer. The grammar is completely identical in both situations, but the power dynamic completely alters what is socially permitted.
To successfully navigate all of this, we rely on sociolinguistic competence to read sociocultural norms and discourse competence to organize cohesive texts. But honestly, perhaps the most vital skill today is intercultural competence. Politeness markers vary wildly across the globe. For instance, passionately debating politics is perfectly acceptable and maybe even expected in a French cafe, but it's often considered a strict social taboo in casual US settings. If you miss that cultural nuance, you risk immediate social conflict.
So, what happens when things go wrong? That's Section 5, Repairing Real-Life Breakdowns and the Power of Strategic Competence. Look, even with perfect knowledge, mistakes happen, especially in diverse global business environments. Picture a native speaker using some fuzzy, ambiguous corporate jargon, saying something like, "We need to optimize the deliverables." A non-native speaker can brilliantly deploy what we call strategic competence by immediately responding, "I didn't catch that, can you clarify deliverables?" By actively asking for clarity in this role-play scenario, they use a verbal strategy to fix a misunderstanding on the fly, which prevents a much more costly business error down the road. And native speakers use these exact same steps every single day. Think about professional news anchors on live television. When they stumble over a word, they don't panic. They smoothly recognize the breakdown and seamlessly execute step 3, self-repair, correcting themselves without missing a single beat. It goes almost completely unnoticed by the audience. That is strategic competence at its absolute finest. All right, Section 6, Theory into Classroom Practice, Teaching Communicative Competence. For all the applied linguistics educators joining this explainer, how do we actually bring these concepts into a university classroom? How do we teach students to navigate social variables instead of just memorizing vocab lists? Well, here's a step-by-step lesson plan. First, shift to low-structure teaching, where students have more autonomy. Second, introduce authentic data and materials, like real TV broadcasts or corporate emails, so they experience language in its natural habitat. And step 3, design open-ended scenario role plays with information gaps, so students are literally forced to adapt to changing power dynamics on the fly. Okay, before we wrap up, let's test your own understanding of Hymes' framework with a super quick pop quiz. Think back to those parameters we covered earlier. Which of the 4 dictates that you really shouldn't use overly familiar slang during a formal job interview? Is it possibility, feasibility, appropriateness, or attestedness? Well, if you guessed appropriateness, you are entirely correct. You might form a perfect slang sentence, but the formal job interview context makes it socially disastrous. And this proves our biggest core takeaway from this entire explainer. Language isn't just a set of abstract rules generated by an ideal speaker. It is the very architecture of our social behavior, and it is deeply intertwined with our cultural identities, our power structures, and our daily interactions. So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. In our increasingly diverse and interconnected world, how will you leverage these communicative competencies to bridge divides rather than build walls? The next time you find yourself in the middle of a communication breakdown, remember Dell Hymes. Look beyond the grammar and really engage with the rich human context right in front of you. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.